It's time for our investor panel. It's going to be run by Cris Deluca from Sanofi Ventures. So I'd like to welcome Cris Deluca, Jonathan Behr, Anne DeWitt, and Robert Garber to the stage.
I'm going to try to round these chairs out so I can kind of look towards you guys. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So nice to be in a room with human beings and not doing this over a webinar, some sort of Zoom session. And I'm a longtime fan of ApplySci. I was just remembering with Lisa, many years ago, we did the first event in New York City, and I guess you guys have been on hold for a couple of years. Something held you up, I don't know what that was, but great to see this all back and live in this beautiful room. So thank you for carving out a few minutes, 30 minutes here for this esteemed investor digital health panel. Today we're going to talk to you about some of the exciting trends, mostly on the back end of the aftermath of 36 months of more or less high injection of capital into the digital health market, levels of acceleration that we haven't seen ever in digital, and really starting to talk about a little bit of the, what's happening now. So there's some volatility, there is some pullback. Are we in a bubble? Are we not in a bubble? Is that bubble popping? But also, what are some of the opportunities that present in these kinds of times of convergence and disruption and sort of shifts in delivery and shifts in regulatory? So we're going to introduce the panel in a little bit of a more interesting way by asking our panelists to be brief. So introduce themselves, say your name, your title, the firm you work with, and your most recent deal, and why you're so excited about it. So I will go first, just to kick off and set the stage. So Cris Deluca, I am a partner at Sanofi Ventures. I focus on digital health and data science investing, and I'll break my own rule. I can't tell you about my most recent investment because it's not announced yet, but a deal I'm excited about that we did recently was a company called Nuclei. And Nuclei is an AI spatial biology company that focuses on machine learning algorithms in order to map out spatial features of the tumor microenvironment for a range of precision oncology applications. Jonathan, you're next.
Thanks for having me. So I work with SV Health Investors, which is a venture management firm, venture and private equity management firm that has 6 different fund strategies, and I specifically invest out of the Dementia Discovery Fund, which focuses on neurological diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, ALS, FTD. The most recent investment that we made that's relevant for this audience is in a company called Cumulus Neuroscience. So Cumulus has a wearable medical grade EEG that they can send home with patients that coordinates with tablet-based cognitive and other exams. And so the idea is that by combining those 2 data sets in real time, you can have a much richer understanding of actually what's going on in the patient's brain. And that's quite exciting for us because it can shrink the size and duration of clinical trials as you're doing therapeutic drug development. And that's really the initial use case. And Cumulus has partnered with, I think now, 10 major pharmaceutical companies who've all put in pilot money to help develop this product.
Awesome. Anne?
Hi, I'm Anne DeWitt. Happy Friday. I'm a general partner at a venture firm called The Engine. Our origin story is somewhat unusual because we were actually born out of MIT. And the most recent investment, and just because I'm looking at Paul LaFlaque, who's sitting right there, that we're very excited about, is in a company called Axoft, where Paul's a founder and the CEO of the company. And we're very excited about the company because it's a novel material that mimics the properties of the brain that we think could be a very new material to get to the types of properties, also the type of chip densities that we need to address some of the issues of the brain and some of the symptoms that we're seeing in patients where there's seizures and other elements where we need more control and over a longer duration than what we have available to us today. So excited to talk through on a Friday afternoon what exciting investment opportunities and needs, because we have a ton of them. This is such a huge area of unmet medical need. I'm not sure how many people have family members or others that have dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or some other neurological disease, but we got to make some headway.
Great. Hi, I'm Robert Garber. I'm partner at Seven Wire Ventures based out of Chicago, and co-invested with Cris in a couple of deals, and actually with Jonathan we just found out in a deal, but our most let's say our most recent interesting deal is in a company called Vivante Health, which is focused on helping the 25% of the population that are battling digestive disorders. So everything from Crohn's and colitis down through IBD, IBS, almost 50% of them go undiagnosed, have comorbid conditions like behavioral health issues, nutrition issues, and other digestive problems. And so we're working on building out a verticalized clinic model for helping those who suffer and have been wandering around in the desert for many years without relief.
So in addition to Robert having great taste in hairstyle, he also has a good taste in company. We also worked with that company when I was at J&J, but good to hear. So thank you for those introductions. So let's just jump into it. Let's spend a few minutes on this point I made around this, capital injection that we saw during the last 36 months into the digital health market. I believe 60 billion went into digital health as a category in 2021. And now the astronomical valuations are starting to calm down. So what does this mean? Maybe just a breeze through the panel. Was that a bubble? Is that bubble popping or not? Anne, kick us off.
All right. So we all know this, but I think COVID was obviously a very rapid accelerant for a whole set of issues that we were facing in digital health. The sort of reimbursement opportunities, regulatory, some of them have stuck in certain countries. Some of them are in danger of actually being pulled back right now that we're post-COVID. But I think I don't think we're going backwards in terms of our ability to engage the patient where they need to be. I think we're going to continue to press forward. In terms of capital, I think so far the 2022 numbers still look just as strong. But I think as we've been seeing some of the valuations, some of the sort of how those teams raise capital, what the milestones are is probably going to be tightened up. But I'm interested in others' views.
Jonathan?
So I think we have to separate sort of the fundamentals of the space from the macroeconomic picture. The cost of capital is going up, interest rates are going up. That being said, the capital's there to invest. Venture, if you're talking about venture, generally closed-end funds. Even if venture funds can't raise new funds, that takes a while to sink into the market in terms of a lack of capital. So the capital's there, and really what we are seeing is a disconnect in expectations between entrepreneurs and investors with respect to what the actual value of a business is. And so I think there was a valuation bubble. I don't think there was necessarily a bubble in terms of the amount of interest and capital that could be or should be deployed into this space. And so it might take another quarter or two for those expectations to align between entrepreneurs and investors. But I think, as Anne said, the fundamentals of the space, I think, are really strong. And I think there'll continue to be active investment, especially first investments in the space.
As I like to say, this is my fourth market cycle I've worked through, and Darwin is alive and well and will show up this year like it does in other past down cycles and take care of some of the companies that probably shouldn't have been funded and don't deserve to exist. But I agree that long-term, the tailwinds will continue. Last week I heard there's still $290 billion of committed and uninvested capital in venture, $1.3 trillion across all alternative investments, which includes PE, growth equity, hedge funds, and the like. So not a lack of capital. I think probably one of the biggest learnings that we've had, we sort of had a yin and yang, right? The yin was the awesome acceleration from a dark time, was the silver lining. The yang is that the yin is that people figured out that changing healthcare is really hard. And despite the 60 billion or so that we put into it, trend this year is still going to be 6 to 7% up. We haven't fixed chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mental health, what have you. So we've got a lot of work to do, which I think bodes well for those of us that are in it for the long term that are trying to do well by doing good.
So, all the funds are open for business and are all actively, recruiting great companies. So sticking with you, Robert, what are the kinds of, value pools of innovation that you're hunting down right now at 7Wire? Is it relative to the theme of this conference, brain tech, neurotech, or other categories?
Interestingly enough, it's chosen two different groups. Like one is some of the new and novel things. Like we are starting to see things in sectors where there hasn't been a lot of investment in brain tech, neurocognitive disorders, trying to address some of the upcoming, pandemic/endemic of Alzheimer's, ALS. I know there was a treatment this week that came out. Parkinson's and some of these conditions. We're also seeing sort of like Gen 2 of people going back and reinvesting in the existing sectors. So new companies focus on cardiometabolic, cardiovascular, mental health, things that have had lots of capital in it, but where we really only started scratching the surface. So it's a little bit of both. Typically a lot of the early money goes into education and the market learning, and then we learn what works and what doesn't work, and then hopefully we try and learn from those mistakes and come up with better and more novel solutions.
And with the theme of the engine, really seeking out the toughest technical challenges and sort of supporting the companies in that space, is that consistent with the attraction of your sort of thesis in investing? And what are you starting to see that in these times, one would guess that the restriction or the criteria and even the financial profile of the companies may modify, and that may or may not be the case with the engine. But curious, sort of, what are you seeing? What are you looking for? And how does that sort of line up with the engine's investment criteria?
Yeah. So I was talking with Rachel Shaw this morning, who used to be the global head of digital for Sanofi, and we were talking about that in the neurospace, we were seeing like MS, multiple sclerosis, has a set of therapies, and the emergence of the sort of sensor technologies to be able to monitor disease, whether it's cognitive, kind of the executive function, or the physical behaviors, but that each of those technologies have started to be pulled together to have an understanding of disease and/or therapy. But and we were talking about this before the panel, it's like, and we can do something about it because we had a set of treatment options. I think as I think we all were very excited about the couple of, one with Amylyx potential in ALS, but also lecanemab we were discussing for Alzheimer's, and those results. As we're having more therapies, I think we'll see faster emergence of some of the digital technologies in this neuro monitoring, diagnosis, and therapy, because we'll have more options on the therapeutic side once we monitor something. So we're sort of looking at that sort of picture and trying to like fill in like where are we seeing opportunities that kind of fit into that landscape as it's developing.
Is that on the early detection side or post-treatment monitoring?
Yeah, as a couple of examples. Yeah.
So Jonathan, maybe a slight twist on that question. Like when you're looking for the opportunities in the current investment thesis of priority, how do you think about ROI on those? And is that sort of shifting based on sort of market volatility?
Well, I think we're always seeking a similar return profile for our companies, and that's why valuations have to change in markets. When you think exit values might change or intermediate financing values might change. I think it's very hard to answer that in generalities, also because we have multiple funds with different strategies. So my colleague over there, Josh, who works for our growth fund, they're looking at a very different profile from an investment perspective than we are when we're generally investing in early stage companies and honestly mostly therapeutics companies. And I think for funds that have the ability to invest in mixed types of assets, mixed types of companies, it's very hard to have a common return expectation across companies and technologies that have very different risk profiles and return profiles. And I think, especially in this space, we've heard about everything from implantable brain interfaces to, more, technologies built off consumer platforms, right? Non-invasive consumer platforms. So I think it's really hard to generalize, and we have very specific areas that we focus on when we source new investments where we see there's a confluence of emerging technology and market opportunity in a space where there's a predictable path to value creation and in our case, regulated products, so regulatory and clinical development pathways.
So we'll stick with you for a moment. So with this looming recession or economic winter and real winter in Boston that's upon us, as we think about what it takes to survive the next, let's call it 24 months as a startup and entrepreneur, and as you're looking at your portfolio companies, what is some of the advice you're giving to those companies in order to weather the storm? And that would be an existing company. And then also, what are you looking for in terms of requirements for new companies that are coming in, saying, hey, you need to have this kind of burn, this kind of runway, this kind of revenue ramp, and give us some of those characteristics as you're thinking about that.
So again, I think it's hard to give absolute answers, but I think the relative answer is easy, and it's just you need to change your expectations from what they were 12 or 24 months ago. Fundamentally, all of our companies, we go in and we say you have to do more with less, right? Or you have to do the same amount with less. Or you need to do less with less, but make sure you're focusing on the right things. And I think 24 months ago, every CEO we had was plotting their path to an IPO. And now that's not an option. And the question is, how do you position yourself for M&A or for strategic partnership or for a potential IPO in 4 years instead of 18 months?
And what of the companies that did IPO in that time? What does the crystal ball hold for them? And I guess either you or anyone can sort of jump in.
Somebody told me if you're ever going to use somebody once told me if you're going to use a crystal ball, you have to be prepared to eat broken glass.
That's right.
So, look, don't know. I think we have probably 3 or 4 quarters of instability here. Right now, the midterms are heavily hanging over the public markets, and that trickles down the private markets. I think there's a lot of concern around cost of capital and inflation, and there's a lot of, let's say, resetting that's going to go on as people sort of right-size valuations and burn. Even in down markets, even in up markets as in down markets, we've always focused on building intrinsic asset value, right? Fundamentals, right? We can't sell $1 for 90 cents and make it up on volume, even though those models sometimes succeed in bubble markets. So, the advice to our companies is you have to build something that has enduring value, that is solving a real world problem, and has a fundamental unit economic model that can scale, right? It doesn't have to scale today, but there has to be a there. And ideally, you'd like to have 18 or 24 months of cash to make that happen, so that you can control your own destiny. And then I think people need to also sort of batten down the hatches from a managerial perspective and really make the main thing the main thing. One of the things that happens in a market of overcapitalization is people stop making the hard decisions, right? They come to a fork in the road and you can go A or B, and they do A and B. And they do both of them usually in not such a successful way. When the market tightens like it does, you have a lot more discipline around managerial decision making, which is a good thing. And actually, historically, if you look at the data over the last 20, 30 years, some of the best venture returns have come out of markets, out of companies that were funded in down markets like we're in now. And if you look at decades of data, 2 or 3 years after a cycle like this, you see massive returns more often than not. And so it's a good time to be an entrepreneur and a good time to be a buyer. You just have to be a patient one and build something that actually is not built on ether.
But you said something really important, and everyone should write it down. If you're building a company and you said something, almost quoting, have 18 to 24 months of runway in your bank account. I think that's a good idea. And so in terms of, let's say, either revenue ramps or sort of exit ramps for companies that are going through the engine or the fund or engine, the space, or both, what does that look, where do they go on to? Do they go on to IPO? Do they go into multiple rounds of funding? What are you seeing in terms of paths to exit?
I feel like you asked me that just to give me a nice inroad, but the engine, we are a startup, and I say we are in Series B ourselves. We've been in existence for 5 years, and so our companies, because of the types of companies in which we invest, are still very young. So I'll let you know how that, but our companies right now, the very first investments from 5 years ago are just getting to the point where revenue ramp is a real thing right now. EBITDA that's still a few years away for the earliest companies. But I think I agree with the comments. I think the good thing for the entrepreneurs in the room is that early stage is always a good place for investors to be when markets look like this. So it's a little tricky because you may have investors coming back who are not typically early stage investors. And I think you got to be pretty careful that you want capital for all the reasons we just identified. But I also think that you need to be sure what that capital looks like. And so as always, if you're an entrepreneur, thinking through who your capital partners are and that they're the right partners is I'd say, never more important than it is in the down round, which sounds tricky because you're looking for money, but who's behind that money, matters. So awesome if you're early stage. Make sure you make those hard choices and make sure you're making real progress against the milestones you've laid out, and talk with your boards about, do we need to adjust the milestones? Do we need to trim down from project 1 and 2 and 3 to project 1? So I think those are the critical things. Awesome time for early stage entrepreneurs. If you're mid-stage, hang on tight and look to see if you can do partnerships with other companies that you might not have contemplated, but you're actually better together as companies. So I think many of the people may know some of RA Capital, some of Peter and the team's comments about kind of this time in the marketplace. But yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
Great words of wisdom. So we are going to shift things up, and we're going to move into something that I like to call, the panel isn't expecting this, by the way, the Mythbusters lightning round. So we're going to go through and ask just quick questions, A or B, and you can give your viewpoint on that. So we'll start with you, Jonathan. So what is the best outcome for digital health companies these days? Is it go into public markets, which we've already said no, M&A, or keep selling, keep growing, keep partnering? In generalities.
Yes. I mean, well, so this is the investor panel, right? Yeah. So I think because the answer for the investors and the management team and the employees are not always the same answer. Yeah. But I think from an investor perspective, M&A is always fantastic because you actually get to pay out to your shareholders, whereas IPOs, not always the case. Lockup periods, market fluctuations, constraints on trading volume. And when you keep operating the business, I mean, obviously that's something you do when you're really excited and you think you're undervalued. But
do you think there will be enriched M&A opportunities in the next 18 to 24 months that maybe weren't available in the past? Do you think this sort of recession could present?
Well, I've seen more data in the therapeutics and pharma space, and I'd say there should be. But unfortunately, it's a lot of it's psychology, right? So valuations go down. You think that companies that have cash should go buy, but then they sit there and they say, well, we want to buy, but the valuation should be lower, right? So there's always that dynamic, right? Of okay, well, are they going to pay what the company wants and thinks they're worth, and the company gets a premium because their valuation's down, or do they not buy because they can't come to agreement on terms? So I hope so. I hope M&A will go up, but it hasn't quite yet.
I love it. So Robert, let's see. Your Mythbuster lightning round question is digital health bloated in capital, or is the whole category underfunded and we're just getting going? You can't say yes.
I was going to say yes. Well, I'll say a couple things. One is historically healthcare, and I started doing this in the mid-'90s, so when I first started doing healthcare, it was really unsexy. It was like procurement and healthcare IT and supply chain and RCM and really unexciting stuff. So I'm super excited that we're finally actually moving into things that can have real impact on people's lives. That said, it's a long game, and we're going to need a lot of capital to make long-term change. So I don't think that there's such thing as having too much capital to try and make the fundamental changes that we need to make our healthcare system sustainable in our country. Right now, it's fundamentally broken, and it's going to take a lot of effort to change some of these broken incentives, change provider behavior, change consumer behavior. It's very, very tough. I will say that these markets are going to separate, sort of the tourists from the real people, from the locals, where they're going to find out that in the technology world, you can disintermediate markets, right? You can go around existing retailers, supply chain, whatever. In healthcare, we need doctors, we need drugs, we need hospitals or clinics of some sort. And so we need to figure out how to co-opt that ecosystem. And that means you have to have a lot of domain experience in it, right? And I think what we've seen historically is when the market went up, we had a lot of people coming in who didn't understand those complexities. So I don't think it's bloated, but I think we need the right money with the right people if we're going to really create change.
Great. And for Anne, your question is, artificial intelligence has potentially incredible transformational potential and is already starting to make its early shifts in healthcare data and healthcare decision support and a wide variety of ranging from drug discovery to other automation equals scale applications. Is artificial intelligence in healthcare overhyped, or is it underhyped? And should capital follow and invest harder to get it going more, or should it slow down because it's all buzz?
I feel like you gave me a softball question because that was like 4 options. So thank you. I think we're just getting started. I think we're just getting started with the real impact, whether it's supply chain, manufacturing processes for complex biologics that decrease the cost of production, understanding the patient and all the integrated data that could come from the sensors of the brain and the tablet, etc. I think we are just getting started. I think it's, but again, I think the points earlier around what are we really investing in, and are those pieces ready for the layers that will be built alongside of either hardware, software embedded, or that we have data sets that we can use into pieces of AI, et cetera, or are we doing sort of de novo AI, like de novo AI, I'd call it. So I think we're just getting started.
Does anyone disagree in the audience that either AI is overfunded or underfunded? Does anyone believe that digital health is underfunded or overfunded, and we're in a good position? Underfunded. I love it. Says the Neurotech AI conference organizer.
I think it's both. And I think one of the biggest problems is if you've got an app that's automated, people are calling that artificial intelligence. So I use the word overinflated because it's over-prescribed maybe, but then I use the word underinflated because there are people actually really doing this kind of work that aren't getting the funding that they need.
So you make the differentiation on true AI versus sort of use of the buzzwords in order to mask sort of automation and workflows.
I unfortunately tell quite a bit of the companies that I'm advising, if you don't have a slide or two that rants and raves about AI, machine learning, natural language processing, you're not going to get funding. They say they keep hearing that. And I said, well, you've got to be authentic. But if you're not talking about it, you're not going to get funding.
It's a great point. So here you have sort of a balanced view, which I love. We have time for 2 questions as we start to conclude the panel. So you can either come up to a mic or raise your hand, and we'd love to have your opinion or questions. Any questions from my co-panelists?
I'll ask the audience a question. Raise your hand if you are raising money or have raised money in the last 12 months. So there should be more questions for us.
Are there any particular therapeutic areas that you guys think is going to be sort of the next wave of healthcare investments, entrepreneurship, discoveries?
Yeah.
It's in the title of our fund. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's like we had a lot of I'm talking to you, so you know. The unmet needs. So, people are all worried, here we go again, like pharma's getting a bad rap, and it's just like, what do we not need to do? We need to focus on the problems that matter to the patients and their families, right? We got massive unmet need in neurological disease. It's for sure. And I would put pain, not only acute but chronic, into that bucket where we have just got to buckle down and figure out how do we actually make progress. But I'm going to stop and because it's in the title of your phone.
Yeah, no, so obviously we think dementia, but the question's why? And I think I mentioned this earlier. You can map out a commercial landscape and say, here's the white space from a commercial standpoint, or you can say, look at the clinical landscape and say, here's the unmet patient need. But those white spaces exist for a reason, and the reason is that there were fundamental challenges keeping products from being developed to fill in those spaces. And so what you have to do is say, what are the fundamental changes in technology or biological scientific understanding of disease or in the regulatory landscape or in the functioning of the healthcare system that are going to enable you to then fill that white space. You can't just say, well, there's no pain drugs, right? So we're going to go after pain. And so we think on the dementia side, there is this huge advancement in the biological sciences and life science that are changing the way we understand these diseases, that are enabling us to go after new drugs or devices. But I think, as was previously mentioned, there are also these huge changes in how healthcare is provided and hopefully how healthcare is paid for that are also going to enable innovators to fill in white space. And so I think you have to be really specific about that eventual product you're aiming at, but also really specific about why you're going to succeed, whereas people or companies in the past have failed.
Yeah, I would take also take a horizontal view of the market, and I would say we have three issues. We have access, affordability, and scalability in our market. You could also, supply is in there as well. And one of the things I'm spending a lot of time thinking about is, my perspective is we're just coming out of what I call the digitization phase, right? Like, we took offline therapeutic modalities and we sprinkled some magic technology, fixed fairy dust on it, and put it online and called it innovative, right? Like, CBT has been around for decades. It works, it's effective, it's actually cost effective and time effective, but it's not transformational. I'm trying to think about what's going to be transformational, right? What's going to fundamentally change some of these equations from a cost, access, and supply perspective, right? Like, the country is in a mental health crisis. We've done an amazing job relative to history at destigmatizing mental health and surfacing the demand, but we've done nothing on the supply side, relatively speaking. So I think we need to start looking at, and I look at this group here, what are those transformative technologies that address some of those just big systemic problems, because they exist in every one of the disease states, no matter where you go. But we've got to take, one of my biggest fears is incrementalism, right? And healthcare has a real problem with historical incrementalism, right? So I think we need to think about what are things that we can do that have more of a step function to create change.
I couldn't agree more. Like, from a Sanofi Ventures perspective, with all the therapeutic areas that we're focused on, we look at sort of these cross-platform digital sort of solutions, and we see mental health as an integration point to every single other disease indication that we look at. So we can sort of see mental health technologies as an integrated part. We have time for one more question I see right here.
Yeah, so physical sciences, life sciences is really expensive. A lot of investors are wary of the risk involved, the long-term payoff, FDA regulation. And so then there's a chicken and egg problem with young researchers and translational scientists of, okay, I need a lot of money to get X, Y, Z done. And then they go to investors, they say, well, we want to see these milestones. And you go, well, those milestones cost money. And they go, well, too bad. At least I've encountered a lot of young entrepreneurs who encounter this chicken egg problem. And it's understandable what that is. What are some of the more creative and, I guess, hacky approaches to breaking out a chicken egg problem beyond just non-dilutive funding, beyond just kind of get an SBIR and go? What are some of the creative and strategic ways you use not to break out of that chicken egg concept phase?
Call Jonathan.
Yeah, I think.
Go to the engine.
So I think it depends on each investor has. Investors are not, as you know, they're not one unimass. Each investor has different sort of requirements, if you will. So the way I think about it is, the entrepreneur is selling something. Not everybody is a customer. So to get to think about what is the thing that you think is most important? I'm going to use the word to sell. The thing that you care about, the impact that you're going to have. Financial returns follow, I believe, that impact. And what are the staged ways to get there? You had just sort of outlined that. So it's trying to think through, in my point of view, since we work with a lot of first-time founders, first-time CEOs, it's how do we get those milestones and capital staged where we are really taking steps to de-risking and or understanding in a way that the founders haven't lost their company by the second round, and the company actually has a chance to show credibility, and often it's technical de-risking. And I would argue if you can't get to a plan that's investable by any investor, then I think you got to rethink what you're selling. However, the universe of investors is very diverse. Venture capital being a slice of that world. That obviously you got venture capital investors up here, but venture is just a very particular slice of that world. So
I see.
yeah.
I want
Final
to plug Cris because, so the first thing is I would have said non-dilutive capital, right? But okay, so if that's not a choice, I'd say the second is finding a strategically interested capital, right? Where they're going to get more value than just the return on the shares they're buying and they're willing to take more risk, right? So maybe a corporate VC, right, might be interested, or maybe a venture philanthropy or a foundation associated VC. I think what worked in the bull market 18, 24 months ago was selling a bigger vision, right? So maybe it seems scary to invest $5 million to build this thing that is still so far from actually generating value. But if you give me 80 million in 5 years, then I'm going to give you an amazing return. That's a challenging story these days, but that cycle might come back.
And before Lisa shuts off our microphones, I will say build something always that patients love, nurses don't mind, and doctors don't hate. Thank you very much
Thank
to
you.
Robert, Anne, and Jonathan, and thank you, Lisa, for including us.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.